Welcome to today's lecturette. I'm Leslie Jones, and today we're going to be continuing our discussion on children in really fragile contexts. And we turn our discussion today to the complex and really confronting issue of child protection as a fragile context. So in today's lecturette, we're going to be looking at providing an outline of the influences towards the growing focus on child protection, the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, and we're going to also provide an overview of child abuse and maltreatment and the impact on child development. But it's important to note that in this lecturette, this is going to be a fairly brief overview to provide context to the work that we do as professionals. Child abuse and neglect is a really complex subject, and a detailed view of the types of abuse won't be covered in this unit per se. We're then going to take a look at the statistical reality of child abuse and maltreatment in this country, and a look at the risk and protective factors associated with child abuse and neglect, and your responsibilities as mandatory reporters. So to begin our discussion today, I really wanted to take a moment to discuss the changing face of the construct of child within the context of massive social changes that occurred during the latter half of the 20th century. During this period of time, the positioning of children began to shift significantly to include a greater focus on child rights and child agency, and we've spoken about that shift in previous lecturettes. Children were no longer being seen as the exclusive responsibility of their parents and families. And perhaps to fully understand where the movement came for child rights, it's important to contextualise the social revolution of the latter half of the 20th century that saw sweeping changes to many traditional social structures of the developed world. And these sweeping changes included things like the civil rights movement in the United States for African Americans, the feminist movement for gender equity and the right to work and equal pay that had its forerunner in the earliest part of the 20th century with the platform for women's rights and their right to vote. There was also the platform of inclusion and the rights for those with disabilities for equal civil considerations and self-determination. So within this context, it's not surprising that children's rights also became a focus. And so within this context, there was a growing realisation that there was a government and societal responsibility for all children, not just those who did not have parents able to discharge their responsibilities. Children had historically been seen as the sole responsibility of their family, particularly child protection issues, with the exception of things such as mass education legislation, where the state stepped in and saw the greater good for all children around education, that we have also spoken about in previous lecturettes, or the social welfare approach for children who did not have families to provide for them, such as orphans of war or those abandoned by their families. So with those exceptions out of the way, the latter part of the 20th century saw governments around the developed world begin to consider deeply their responsibilities to make sure that children were protected, that they were safe, and that their well-being was safeguarded in a general population level approach. And so one of the watershed moments in terms of the discourse around child rights was founded in the latter part of the 20th century through the United Nations and their conventions on the rights of the child. So the international discourse on the rights of the child began in 1959 with the United Nations making a declaration for the rights of children that focused on the provision of education, health, nutrition, shelter and protection. And this course ran for nearly 30 years before the convention was held, and the 54 articles of the convention were put into a General Assembly of Member Nations of the United Nations in 1989. And the member nations became signatories to this convention, including Australia a year later in 1991, thereabouts. As signatories to the UNCRC, member nations are bound to adjust laws and policies to ensure that the rights of children are secured. The United Nations Conventions of the Rights of the Child is a unique document that is an international agreement between nations of how children should be treated and protected. It crosses cultural, legal and international boundaries to provide a global recognition of children and their rights, and as such sets out the obligation that member nations are expected to fulfil. The Convention deals with a wide range of child-related issues from a rights perspective, including inter-country adoption, child abuse, sexual exploitation, drug-related issues, and the rehabilitation of children who have been exploited or traumatised. Further, the Convention also steps out children's right to be included, consulted, and involved in matters that affect them. These are really broad captures of intent from an international community. And as the articles step out the rights of children, the implementation for policies, practices, and processes in signatory countries comes into sharp focus. Implementing the Convention has had its challenges. In 2018, the Australian Human Rights Commission conducted a review of our implementation of the UNCRC, and the report can be found on the website that's on your slide at the moment. And while the report recognises that the work done so far has been very positive and stepping in the right direction, it also makes it very clear that Australia still has a very long ways to go in terms of meeting its obligation. And in particular, the lived experiences of our Aboriginal children and the levels of child abuse and government responses continues to be a challenging context for delivering on our obligations under the Convention. Within this challenging context, it is critical that child advocates and professionals alike continue to be vocal about child rights and to critically reflect on their daily practices to see living examples of how child rights are being enacted and supported in our local communities and childcare environments. And so as we consider child protection, it's important that we stop and recognise what is it that we are actually protecting children from. And of course, that is around child abuse and maltreatment. There are 4 recognised forms of child maltreatment and abuse, and they include physical, emotional, psychological, neglect and sexual abuse. In defining child abuse and maltreatment, there is a recognition that there is a government responsibility to protect children from such contexts where there is a significant risk of harm occurring to children. However, while there is consistency in recognising what constitutes abuse, there is wide discrepancy in when state authorities should intervene in order to provide protection for young children. Your text highlights some of the complex conditions that government agencies must consider in developing policy and practice responses. For example, when does constant belittling of a child become emotional abuse? And this simple example highlights the very complex context in which people working with child abuse and protection issues need to apply professional judgment as to when does significant harm actually be realised. The ongoing discourse for nations and their governments is about striking the right balance between parental rights and child rights. And how do governments support child rights without diminishing or abdicating parental rights? What is and should be the domain of parents to raise their children within a rich familial context that we know is so important for their development? And where and in what ways should government work alongside or intervene in family life? There is no single or simple answer for these questions, but a diligent focus and commitment to the conventions of the rights of the child's intent provides the guide rails for those invested in positive child outcomes. As we consider child protection issues in Australia, it's important to understand the prevalence of child abuse and maltreatment in our country that our agencies and communities are dealing with. And you can see on the slide there in front of you that there has been a consistent increase in the number of child notifications. So if we look at the statistical information on the slide, you can see that the data capture at 2011 to 2012 had 33.8 children per 1,000 children in child notifications, with a rise between then the years 2015 to 16 of 42 children per 1,000 were subject to child notifications. And then if we then start to look at what does that actually mean, for the 2014-15 year, as your text indicates, that meant somewhere in the vicinity of 320,000 notifications of child abuse or child at risk notifications coming through to government agencies. And of that number, we see that just under half of those notifications were investigated. So sufficient concern raised with the government agencies that officers were appointed to those notifications and did formal investigations of the context in which young children were living. And of those that were investigated, we can see that about 20% of those notifications were actually substantiated. So that's nearly 42,500 children were found to be living under circumstances of abuse or maltreatment. What's most concerning around these notifications is that we see a substantial increase in substantiated abuse reports. So if we look at the years between 2010 and 2015, nearly a 40% increase of substantiated abuse reports. And so the question is probably, is prevalence increasing in our community, or is reporting becoming more prevalent? And the truth is it's probably a mix of both. Of those reported increases in notifications and substantiated child abuse or maltreatment cases, emotional abuse was by far the most common, with about 43% of all substantiated cases being relevant to emotional abuse. There was 26% of all confirmed notifications situated around neglect, while physical abuse held about 18% of confirmed cases and sexual abuse 13%. In saying that, these statistics don't necessarily tell the full picture, and we need to recognise that some children in these reports were subject to multiple forms of abuse. And as we consider the increase in the substantiated abuse statistics that we see, we also have to recognise that there has been a changing of the guard in the way in which we define and understand abuse. So, for instance, some adult behaviours that historically would not necessarily have been considered abusive are now considered to be behaviours of significant concern. So things like including physical punishments such as using straps or belts or canes in decades gone past would not have met the threshold for abuse, where today that they do. And additionally to that, we now recognise that children that are exposed to witnessing domestic violence is also now being seen as a form of emotional abuse, which may well contribute to the significant increase and representation of emotional abuse in substantiated cases of child protection notifications. The statistics for child protection and child abuse and maltreatment in this country should give all of us pause for concern, and highlights the significant level of work yet to be undertaken and successfully implemented in our local communities and at government levels for the right type of funding and initiatives to ensure that we can improve the statistics around child protection in this country. Moving on from the statistical reality of the volume and prevalence of child abuse and maltreatment, we need to also understand what are the statistical risk and protective factors that are relevant in our communities around child abuse and maltreatment. And from the data, we know that there are some identified risk profiles that, as people working with children and families, we need to be aware of. And they include things such as structural risks. So looking at things like in the data, there is an overrepresentation of single parent families with mothers at the head of those families. Aboriginal families are overrepresented in the statistics on confirmed child maltreatment and abuse, and also families experiencing things such as disadvantage, social stress, poor accommodation, social isolation, or poverty. And another risk profile that again is demonstrated in the statistical data is the parent characteristics that can be present in some homes. So including things like parental mental health, the responses to stress, the education levels of families, social isolation, and backgrounds of prior abuse of parents as children themselves. And then also looking at then another risk profile of the child characteristics involved. So the developmental stage of children, those who are developmentally less mature are at greater risk. The overall health of children, if children have a disability or not, the overall temperament of children, so are they difficult or slow to warm up or easy children, and sometimes the behavioural patterns that children can demonstrate. And I just want to make the point that at no point is anyone suggesting that there is a responsibility for child abuse on children, but we know when we combine these risk profiles of structure, parent characteristics and child characteristics, we start to get a statistical picture of those children who are potentially at most risk of maltreatment and abuse. And then we also need to consider the protective factors that, again, statistical analysis is actually indicating. And they include things like families who are under stress having appropriate and accessible access to community support programs and community support agencies, and having really robust and broad social networks as a mitigating factor against some of the structural and parenting and child characteristics that can present a risk profile. And it's really important to understand that all of these factors do not cause abuse on their own, but rather, either in isolation or in combination, they represent a statistical potential for risk of child harm. And of course, we must also recognise that many families who are experiencing these dynamics of risk, either in structural or in parenting characteristics or child dynamics, do not have issues of child maltreatment present in their family homes. Equally, it's important to recognise that these risk factors have been identified through statistical research and data, and as such, we must also recognise that abusive situations can be present in families where none of these identified risk factors are present. We've also spoken in previous lecturettes about risk factors and that they do not always mean poor outcomes. Protective factors such as the networks and community support are also really important to recognise as critical buffers against abuse. There is really encouraging evidence that where risk factors are present, supporting parents with the right types of support, the right types of monitoring, and the right types of parent education programs and support programs can make a really positive difference and has the potential to break the cycle of abuse and reduce parental reactivity to stressful situations of everyday parenting. I'd now like to turn our discussion to our professional responsibilities of people working with children and young people, to that of mandatory reporting of child abuse. Mandatory reporting is a term used to describe the legislative requirements for a select group of people to report suspected cases of child abuse and neglect to government authority. Each state has separate legislation regarding mandatory reporting, but broadly include all people working closely with children, and that includes teachers and educators in early learning services in most states, with the exception of Western Australia. Mandatory reporters are obliged by law to notify relevant authorities when they have reasonable concerns that a child is at risk of child abuse or neglect. They are not required to have evidence and proof of abuse before they report, but rather need to exercise professional judgment around the degree of concern or the degree of likelihood that a child may be at significant risk of harm or neglect. And they need to report when they have these concerns, suspicions, or belief based on reasonable grounds. And the website that you can see on your slide at the moment has a full publication around the mandatory requirements for child abuse and neglect by state. So as people working with children and young people, it is essential that you understand your legislative requirements for reporting suspicions of child harm and neglect and maltreatment to the relevant authorities in your state. Reporting your suspicions around child maltreatment or abuse to regulatory authorities can be a really confronting process, but I think it's really important for you to recognise, as professionals working with children, that the process of reporting is not suggesting that you are the arbitrary decider of whether or not abusive situations are in fact evident, but rather you are flagging to government agencies staffed by people with significant expertise in understanding the investigative process around child risk and child harm, and handing over to them your suspicions so that they can more fully understand the circumstances in which children are living. In all cases, you are likely not to hear what the outcome of those investigations will be, but it is important as a working professional that you do not abdicate the responsibility of raising concerns with the necessary agencies to ensure that children are not living in circumstances where it is unsafe and where families are struggling, that they have access to the very support programs who may prevent them from losing their children into out-of-home care. It's a significant professional responsibility, and one that you should be prepared to shoulder and to enact whenever you have the reasonable suspicions that a family may need support or a child needs help. And finally, in this session, I want to take a brief moment to really discuss the impact of child abuse on development. It's not difficult to imagine the impact of child abuse and maltreatment is potentially very severe. Children living under the pressure of an abusive environment are exposed to the most toxic of contexts and provide the grounds for the most significant negative impacts on child development. Children living under such circumstances often display, both in the here and now, but also into later life, problems with attachments and problems with building the sort of secure and positive relationships that we know are important for overall well-being as well as child development. Children in these same contexts can often develop very poor self-esteem and poor self-image of themselves as a human being. And poor self-confidence and sometimes poor self-regulation can be a result. We can also see children exhibit very aggressive behaviours when they're living under these sorts of stressors, or anxiety and depression. And we know that children can also exhibit social isolation and poor peer relationships. And as we've worked through Module 1 of this unit, you should all recognise that children who don't actually develop in these core dynamics of human development well and with positive outcomes in those areas are really at a deficit to their peers and at a deficit to reaching the potential that they have as individual human beings. Risks for adult substance abuse and mental health issues are also a long-term impact of children who are exposed to child abuse and maltreatment. And the early intervention into these sorts of toxic environments is really key to mitigating the impact of child abuse. Your text makes the point, however, that while it is well recognised that early intervention and prevention strategies are critical to mitigate child abusive situations, most system responses remain really grounded in a reactionary approach. Child protection is everybody's responsibility. As someone working and choosing to work with children and families, you will undoubtedly encounter children who are at risk of significant harm or who are actively experiencing abusive environments. It is your responsibility and your mandatory obligation to understand the risk profiles and indicators of abuse and to make the necessary notifications and reports to the statutory bodies in your state. This is never an easy part of your professional work, but the children you will work with need you to stand up and count towards keeping them and others safe. Thank you for joining me for today's discussion. I look forward to having you join me again in our next session, where we will be expanding our discussion on child protection and to move beyond understanding what is child protection to discuss the system and community responses to child protection.